Welcome, everyone. Thanks for listening to Mex Moves, our weekly podcast in which Damien Fraser and I digest Mexico's business world. How are you doing, Damien?
Very well, Eduardo.
Great. This week, we have two very interesting interviews about Mexico's energy sector, mainly on the electricity sector. On one hand, we spoke to César Hernández Ochoa, a former Deputy Minister of Electricity during the Peña Nieto administration, the government that opened up Mexico's energy sector to private interests, which has obviously been rolled back partially. He will give us an outlook of what happened and how is he viewing the current situation. On the other hand, we speak to José Antonio Aguilar, an investor, a founder of a wind power company in the Yucatan Peninsula. So he will give us a hands-on view on private money coming into the sector from the time the industry was opened up to where it stands now and how they went out during the previous administration of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who was quite opposed to private interests in that industry. So, Damien, why don't you kick us off? What do you have this week that is of interest?
Sure, Eduardo. This week we got two news from Fibra Uno or Funo, the largest real estate REIT or Fibra in Mexico. First, it's internalizing its management. Investors see that as pretty positive. And second, the CEO announced on his LinkedIn account that they're planning to IPO its industrial division in July, which also would be quite positively received if it should be concluded. So on the internalization, as you know, right now, most of the Fibras in Mexico, not all of them, pay an external manager to manage the assets and to acquire assets. And that's been a bit controversial in the sense that the shareholders of the Fibra would rather those revenues stay within the Fibra and be paid to employees to manage the assets and not third parties. Most REITs in the United States are external. Fibra Uno is the largest, and it's announced that it's going to move to internalization. It will pay the external managers that will be giving up this fee, which is to sponsor the Elman family, 10.5 billion pesos, about $500 million. It won't be paid in cash, but it'll be paid in real estate assets. So the family will get from Fibra Uno the Samara office assets, some retail assets in Mitán, Jalisco, Montes Orares here in Las Lomas, which is 620, which is mixed use. So the valuation, it seems to be very, very reasonable. The market, is thus supportive, and this helps realign incentives between Funo's management and shareholders. And it will also save, Funo once they make this payment. About, I think it's going to increase their funds from operations, or basically their free cash flow, by about 3%. They'll lose some money from the transferred assets, but they'll win a lot more money from not paying third-party fees, especially M&A fees, which in the past have been quite significant. Also interesting that the Elmans are taking mostly office space, which is underperformed compared to industrial real estate. Maybe it's a sign that they believe office is ready for a recovery after a very difficult sort of post-COVID period. And then secondly, Eduardo, Fibra Next, their industrial IPO, which was going to be a carve-out of the industrial assets that belong to Funo, seems to be back on track. And the CEO announced on LinkedIn that it's planned to happen in July, in a month's time. It's going to be much smaller than the original Next IPO. It's going to be about 10 billion pesos, $525 million. I think it will be mostly targeted locally, although there's going to be an international tranche as well, according to a Bloomberg story. The new Fibra Next has about 9 industrial properties, 750,000 square meters, and about 29% is under development or stabilization, and it's designed around last mile logistics, distribution hubs, e-commerce fulfillment. So unlike the original what was called the Jupiter portfolio plan, which this will only include third-party and sponsored assets up front. And so Funo's assets, initially at least, will stay with Funo, and then it is assumed they'll be transferred to the new entity once the price of the new entity is established and everyone could agree on a fair swap. So they're learning, I guess, from what happened before. It's a smaller deal. It's going to be easier to do, and they're putting the non-Funo assets in it first. But I think overall it's a good development. And actually, that's how, if I remember rightly, how Funo organized its original IPO. They downsized it, made it small, and then once it got traction in the market, they grew.
Yeah, interesting. Finally, they squared their equation to come out of the market and do it in the next few weeks. On my end, Damien, I don't know if you saw that the Mexico's Regulatory Telecommunications Institute, the IFT, issued a fine for about $100 million to América Móvil that included also a smaller fine to OXXO for setting up like an exclusive contract and banning other SIM cards to be sold on those retail outlets. The SIM card is what identifies you in your phone, connects you with your telephone provider. And the IFT found that practice was monopolistically in relative terms and decided to fine Slim's América Móvil company, the Mexican subsidiary. The fine sounds good amount of money, but it didn't move the share price much. Neither did it do it for OXXO, which is about $1 million for the fine. It just shows, again, how important the regulatory element in Mexico is to keep companies from engaging into practices that are unfair to others. Obviously, América Móvil immediately said that was unfair, that it was baseless, what they were mentioning about what it accomplished with OXXO. But again, in the realm of a very competitive market, it is important to have regulation, and we'll have to wait and see how Mexico transfers the responsibilities of the IFT to the new digital agency that will be in charge of overseeing that companies don't fall into unfair practices.
Yeah, so the FIEMEX is saying it's not true that they didn't have this exclusivity with OXXO. OXXO is also saying it's not true. I think it'd be a fairly easy thing to determine, go into an OXXO and at the time and find out if they were selling other SIM cards. And FIEMEX is going to challenge this fine. And meanwhile, the IFT has been disbanded and replaced by kind of different agencies, digitalization agencies, and Conducef and so on. So it remains to be seen whether the new entities will have the same investigatory powers and legal powers to enforce competition judgments of this nature. But meanwhile, you've seen an explosion of new SIM cards from the MVNOs, especially Byte from Walmart, which has got up to 20 million customers. So in a way, the genie's out of the bottle that anyone can get a SIM card if that's what they want from anyone at this juncture. So on my side, Eduardo, there's been another positive development in the capital market. We mentioned the upcoming IPO of Fibra Next, but also a new Fibra was launched this week, FIEMEX, Fideicomiso de Inversión en Energía México. It's a Fibra E, which is like an energy REIT, and it debuted on the stock market and has actually a very impressive market cap of $4.5 billion. So it makes it one of the largest companies in Mexico and certainly largest fibras. But it's worth bearing in mind, Eduardo, that it wasn't a traditional capital raise, as I understand it. I was looking at the prospectus this morning. It was mainly a corporate restructuring in that the existing shareholders of these assets, and these are the former Iberdrola assets, which own the assets through Sicade, through a private equity fund, basically swapped their ownership in the Sicade, in the private equity fund, to the Fibra. So there's a 99% of the market cap is a straightforward swap, and then there's some 1 or 2% additional related to performance shares for the sponsor. So it's not an IPO that's going to be making investment bankers rich, because there isn't a lot of fees to be charged when there isn't a lot of new money going into the asset. As you may recall, Eduardo, the FIEMEX's assets are as I mentioned, the 13 power plants bought originally by the Mexican government or entities of the Mexican government from Iberdrola. Those are 12 combined cycle gas plants and one wind farm. It has about 8,500 megawatts, and they represent about 55% of Iberdrola's former operations. So Iberdrola kept mostly the renewable operations, and they're spread amongst different states like Nuevo León, Oaxaca, Tamaulipas, Durango, San Luis Potosí, Baja, and Sinaloa. So the plants have operate mostly under an IPP, an independent power producer model, and have power purchase agreements, or PPAs as they're called, with the CFE. Most of these PPAs are 25 years or so, and they're take or pay, so there's not much risk. CFE pays for them, come what may. So you're basically taking CFE, and under the Fibra model, you pay out 95% of the cash flow in the form of dividends, and you don't get to pay tax at the corporate level, although obviously the beneficiaries, unless they're Mexican pension funds, pay tax on their returns. Under the original structure, which has basically been repeated in the Fibra, FONADIN, which is the government's national infrastructure fund, has a majority of the entity, so they effectively control it. Mexico Infrastructure Partners, a very successful private equity fund focused on infrastructure, is the manager and the trustor. And now you have, you had, I think it's according to Heraldo newspaper, 7 Afores or Mexican pension funds that were in the Secade have now swapped into the Fibra, that's Profuturo, Banamex, Afore 21, all the big ones. So they're going to be owning about 35% of the Fibra, and FONADIN 65%, roughly speaking. I think and we're going to hear more about it in our interview in a second, but I think it's quite important because Mexico needs to attract new capital if it's going to avoid electricity shortages over the next 6 years. And this vehicle, if it were to raise more money, for example, could be an entity that does that. So from 2020 to 2024, demand of electricity was growing at quite a rapid 3%, and supply was growing less fast than that. So at about 2.5%. So Brazil, for example, has about a 30% oversupply of electricity. You need a cushion to deal with peak demand, whereas Mexico's oversupply is only about 3%, which is very low. The government has announced a big plan to invest in electricity. It's a $33.5 billion plan, and the hope is that private investment will take that up to $45 billion. But for the private investors to come in, you need to have regulatory certainty and regulatory stability, and maybe this Fibra will help, among other things, achieve that.
Without a doubt, and I think also for the Afores it's a nice way to change what they invested in the sense that they will get with the Fibra some payments, regular payments, right? As they were invested in the Secade, it was only valuation that they were expecting to come out with for the workers. Am I correct in saying that the swap makes it also palatable for the Afores?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very astute point. I mean, the Fibra, in order to be a Fibra, has to pay out 95% of free cash flows, and the Secade doesn't have the same obligations, so they'll be getting cash flows from their investment after the debt's been, and the interest on the debt has been paid, which is still quite significant, as they took on a fair amount of debt to acquire these assets from Iberdrola. They originally acquired for over $6 billion. But I think it's a pretty happy ending. I think a lot of people were very critical at the time of the Iberdrola transaction, but it seems to have been managed in a fairly efficient way, and we don't know to what extent the Afores had their arms twisted to enter originally in the Secade and now in the Fibra, but the end result looks from the outside reasonably good and helpful for the country as it needs to attract this, at least $15 billion of investment in electricity, because GDP has become a lot more electricity intensive. So electricity demand has been growing faster than GDP demand, basically because of data centers and electrification of mobility. So we've become a much more electric orientated company,
consumers.
which is good for the environment, as long as you're not using too much diesel in your electricity plants, which Mexico does to some extent. But certainly if you're using renewables or you're using natural gas, there's a lot less of a carbon footprint. But it does require this investment, and very little was done under the AMLO regime because of the uncertainty and the rejection of the 2013 reforms. Now we're moving into something that's fairly similar to what Mexico had before the 2013 reforms. So under these IPPs, PPAs, you're basically taking CFE, which is basically Mexican government risk. So hopefully you can attract the necessary investment.
That's right. It's a good, happy ending in a way. Anything else, Damien?
So just a few snippets before we hand over to the interviews, Eduardo. Amazon launched a digital debit account in partnership with Invex Bank and MasterCard. It's called Amazon Access. No branches, no fees, no minimums. You get an instant digital card and a free physical card. It's a lot less attractive on the face of it than the Mercado Pago card, which offers 15% yield up through GBM up to a certain amount. And it doesn't offer credit, which Mercado Pago also does. But I'm guessing that Mercado Libre has outsold recently Amazon, it seems, and that this is partly a defensive move and maybe the first of many, many moves, although I think Amazon is most likely to be offering credit through third parties, as it already does. It has a buy now, pay later product with Quesky, the Guadalajara-based credit entity. And then EasyCorp, the US pawn giant, has just made yet another move in Mexico. It announced the acquisition of 40 pawn shops under the brands Monte Providencia and Tu Empeño Efectivo. And it's a second acquisition in a few months. We have now, I think, 600 stores in Mexico. So Mexico is a top market for them, and they compete with Globcash, which has Casa Mazatlan, and then First Cash, which is also a US listed company with lots of pawn shops, and then a whole series of local regional pawn shops. And then finally, Krispy Kreme. You'll be, as a Krispy Kreme fan, Eduardo, will be very pleased with their announcement this week that they're opening a new Teatro de Donas, a 50 million investment. It's going to produce 7,000 donuts a day. And you can go and you'll be able to go and see your favorite donuts be made. And then you can either buy them right there, where presumably they'll be very fresh and delicious, or they're going to also be sent out to 90 Krispy Kreme sales points. So Mexico's sweet tooth is proving an attractive market for Krispy Kreme, which I think makes more than 5% of its sales out of Mexico right now.
Well, I'm a fan, as you said, and I know that probably the government does not like the fact that we're promoting sweets, but it's for adults, not for kids. And once in a while, it doesn't hurt, I guess. But anyway, shall we move on to our two interviews, Damien?
Sounds good.
This week on Mex Moves, we're joined by César Hernández Ochoa to discuss the current state of Mexico's energy sector. César, as some of you may know, served as Deputy Minister of Electricity during the administration of President Enrique Peña Nieto. In the role, he was instrumental not only in implementing Mexico's landmark energy reforms of 2013 and 2014, but also in drafting the electricity industry law and related legislation that set the conditions for private sector participation in power generation. He played a key role in creating the wholesale electricity market, unbundling the state-owned utility CFE to promote fair competition, launching clean energy certificates, and designing competitive renewable energy auctions that led to some of the lowest solar and wind prices in the world at that time. However, many of those reforms have since been rolled back. Former President Andrés Manuel López Obrador opposed Peña Nieto's energy agenda and worked to stall its implementation. now under President Claudia Sheinbaum, recently approved constitutional reforms have partially reversed the opening of the sector to private capital. These changes not only guarantee CFE a 50% share of power generation, but also give the company and the energy ministry broad control over the entire electricity industry. César currently leads his own consulting firm, Publius, which specializes in legal advisory and strategic solutions in administrative law, regulatory affairs, and the implementation of public policy. César holds both an undergraduate and doctoral degree in law from UNAM and a master's degree in law and diplomacy from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. César, thank you for joining us on Mex Moves.
No, thank you, Eduardo, and thank you, Damien.
César, before we get into your assessment of where Mexico stands in terms of the development of its energy sector, let me begin with a broader question. Former President López Obrador repeatedly claimed that the Peña Nieto administration's ultimate goal was to destroy the state-owned power company, CFE. Do you think there was any truth to that claim?
Well, he certainly believed it. I mean, in his last book that he published just before leaving the administration, he mentioned, he talked about energy in very emotional and personal terms. He said that when the constitutional amendments to allow private entry into electricity were passed in 2013, that cost him a heart attack. He had to go to the hospital. So it's a very, very a thing which is very close to him emotionally and ideologically. On its terms, the 2013 reforms were passed. One of the aims was to strengthen CFE, not to destroy it. So it depends on who you ask. If you asked former President López Obrador, he would say, no, this was created to destroy it. And if you ask the people who participated in those years, we thought, and people like me still think, that we were doing things to strengthen it. What those reforms did, if you want to summarize it in a nutshell, was basically allow more efficient forms of private entry into electricity, to introduce more competition, and to introduce more modern forms of governance for the state-owned enterprises, and particularly for CFE. So if you think, like I do, that a combination of private and public enterprise is good and better than either a private or a public monopoly, then you would probably think that those reforms were good. If you think competition forces you to be more efficient, whether you are private or public, that's also one thing that should be good for you. It should incentivize you to do better. And modern forms of corporate governance work well for most public state-owned companies in the world. In fact, Mexico was lagging behind by a lot. Brazil, Ecuador, their state enterprises were had adopted best corporate governance practices much before Mexico did. So that's one thing, one way of looking at it. So I think the reform was predicated, the 2013 reform was predicated on the basis that it would strengthen CFE. It gave it all those things I mentioned. It allowed it to have more flexibility to compete, to have affiliates to develop an energy business, a gas business, to reduce its pension liabilities by half. So there were many things that allowed CFE to get financing in better terms, to be better managed, and to deal with some of its debt, for instance, its pension obligations that were reduced. And if you look at it as a company and you want it to lose money, well, that's one of the things that I think were attempted with this reform.
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we had an arbiter that it wasn't either involved like you or who was against it ideologically, I think the design of what you guys did would turn out to be a better company than it was before, and not to completely destroy it as he did.
One of the things that is not said very much is a lot of what happened back then was kept during the López Obrador years and taken advantage of. And it was, just not publicized, but different legal entities created under the CFE holding structure were kept during those years. They were used to finance the new projects that López Obrador administration presented. There was a fund created to universalize electricity access. It was not destroyed. It was kept, and it kept working. And So it's interesting, the continuity despite the rhetoric.
Now, in hindsight, were there areas where CFE was indeed at a disadvantage under the 2013-2014 reforms, situations that might have required government action to level the playing field with private operators?
Well, certainly there are always areas of opportunity, and there are always mistakes. And these reforms we're talking about are a decade old. I mean, those took place 10 years ago. So technology evolved, business models evolved. So many things would have had to be fixed or corrected. But typically, the things that were criticized by the López Obrador administration were contracts, for instance, the self-supply contracts that CFE had signed. Oh, not that CFE had signed, that were introduced as a way of providing private electricity in the 90s, in the 2000s. So those were before the 2013 reforms. They were the models used in the 90s worldwide. So lots of things could have been corrected. In many places, in the Czech Republic, in Italy, in Spain, some of those contracts were renegotiated and they caused a lot of investor-state arbitrations. The same thing, could have happened in Mexico. So it was self-supply was one of the things that said, well, these guys are not paying enough for the use of the grid, and they are getting some advantages that CFE doesn't have. And there was a point to that. CFE also complained that the contract signed with the gas pipeline companies, they were paying very high rates. The prices were not fixed. They were abusive of CFE. They talked about contratos leoninos, which is some sort of an abusive contract. There was a dispute inside the López Obrador administration. Then the late Carlos Ursúa, who was then Minister of Finance in the López Obrador administration, begged to disagree with Manuel Bartlett that those were abusive contracts. He specifically said in an interview that Manuel Bartlett did not understand the concept of net present value, which probably didn't make Ursúa very popular with López Obrador, who preferred to talk about abusive private companies rather than net present value. But the thing is, some of the things, there were many things that could have been fixed. I'm not sure that the things that were criticized, one, were a part of the 2013 reform. They came from a decade earlier. And two, some of the things were not necessarily wrong in the terms that they were criticized. But in hindsight, there are many things that could have been done since then to fix and to improve the level playing field in the sector. Typically, when you look at OECD reports or industrial reports, the problem is not that the private companies have the playing field leveled in favor of them in Mexico, but rather than they have to face a company that has monopoly power and that controls the grid and many things. So if you look at it from a different perspective, it would be the other way around. I mean, it's playing field had to be leveled, just to make it more equitable for private competition.
César, if we look forward, could you give a brief description of how you see the new landscape under the Sheinbaum administration, and whether you think these latest changes, the sort of softening of the AMLO counter reforms, if you will attract sufficient investment, the sort of 2 gigawatts a year, either from CFE itself or the private sector, in generation and then in transmission, which is also badly lacking?
Well, the Sheinbaum administration she passed a constitutional amendment late last year. They had the votes to pass it, and they did. It was the same constitutional amendment that had been presented by AMLO, by López Obrador in February of 2024. And it was some ambiguous modification of the Constitution. Did include something that was not originally in the López Obrador bill, but that was introduced by Congress, by the new Congress under Claudia Sheinbaum, which was a provision that said that any activity where CFE or FIEMEX would participate would not be subject to competition disciplines. So they could not be charged as doing monopolistic practices in anything they did. That was not originally, and that's a very, challenging provision if you're a private company that wants to compete with companies that have market power. No? So, but the package of legislation and the public officials that were appointed by Claudia Sheinbaum, I would think they are reassuring for investors because they were not ideologues. They were technical people. Many of them came from the academia or had experience in financial areas. The Minister of Energy comes from the finance area of the Mexico City administration under Sheinbaum. The undersecretaries are academics from UNAM who are experts in energy transition. CEO of CFE is the first woman CEO of CFE is an engineer who has been there all her life, and she has technical expertise on generation and administration of that company. So the profile of the people was not, ideologues such as Manuel Bartlett, who was a politician, but who had made a career out of attacking private participation in the energy sector. So this is not the type of people that Claudia Sheinbaum shows, and that's reassuring. The package of secondary legislation that implemented that constitutional amendment also it's 85% of what is in the electricity sector law, the new law that was passed in March, is very similar to what was introduced in the electricity industry law in 2014. So it has the wholesale electricity market. It has an independent system operator, SENACE. It has several provisions which call for competition, for efficiency. It calls for economic dispatch, merit order based. It calls for a planning of the growth of the system and the grid that is done using an algorithm that minimizes the cost for the system. Many of the things that were introduced in 2014 were kept in the new legislation in 2024. That being said, several things were of the modifications. That 15% that differs talks about, prevalence for state-owned utility, for CFE, some sort of preference that should be given to CFE in terms of dispatch. Eduardo mentioned that 54% of the energy dispatched by the system should be CFE or state-generated electricity. So it does imply some sort of market power to be given to CFE. It does call for binding planning, which extends to generation, which basically gives the ministry the ability to decide where every generation plant, a new generation plant that will be built by the private sector, can or cannot be located. It has to match the planning preferences of the state. That was not there before. It was a market where you could decide where you located your generation plant. All the things they introduced schemes to try to attract private investment, and they created a scheme called mixed investment schemes, which is companies, some sort of joint ventures. It has yet to be specified how they will work, but ventures where companies where CFE will have 54% of the stock, and the private companies will have 46%, and they will be able to generate electricity and do it together with CFE. And that's there are some specific rules, even in the laws, as to how those would work. They are not very attractive to private investors, at least as they have been discussed behind closed doors in consultations. But they are fine-tuning it, and they may end up working. Who knows? They're put forward some schemes that resemble those that were criticized in the previous administration under a new name. They have these independent power producers, and they are recreating them as long-term power producers, long-term power production. They have a new self-supply scheme, which they call self-consumption, and which also will be allowed. So they're opening venues for doing joint ventures with CFE, selling electricity to CFE under schemes like those in the 90s, with more limitations, that has to be said. And that's also another thing that will not make them very attractive. And they have self-consumption schemes, which resemble self-supply, and that should they should be escapable for the demand of the industrial sector that, industrial parks and that want to get their own electricity and don't want to buy it from CFE. So 85% what was before, and this 15% with this prevalence, some sort of binding planning things to strengthen CFE, and some venues for private participation, which have yet to convince investors and have yet to be specified in the regulations.
So I take it from that you're not especially optimistic that the private investors, the savvies of this world, will put in the necessary money to grow the electricity generation and transmission in the way that the country needs.
The thing is, the new schemes are an unknown number. We'll have to try them out. And that happens in every reform. When in the 2013-2014 reform, the first, Eduardo mentioned how these long-term auctions for renewables got some of the lowest electricity prices for solar and wind in those years. And that's true. There were articles in The Economist saying, oh, well, these Mexicans are getting the lowest prices for renewables. We thought they were expensive. There were an article by a former Nobel Prize winner from Stanford, Stephen Chu, who said, well, if you want to look at a model for developing renewables without subsidies, look at the Mexican way of doing these things. But when we started those auctions, I mean, we didn't know if they were going to work. So we were attempting a strange way of making every renewable technology compete with each other, which was not at all the practice back then. And when the first auction was successfully adjudicated and got those record-setting prices, the first people to be surprised were the people in the Ministry of Energy and in SENACE. And back in that moment, which was 2016, in the middle and March of 2016, that's when we started to think, oh, this is going to work. The new schemes, they have to undergo that transition. But there are some things which do not make me very optimistic, which is they're trying some of the schemes tried in the 90s, but they are putting more restrictions on them. You can have an independent power producer, but you have to transfer the property of the generation plant when the contract ends. That makes it less attractive for private finance or for private investors. You can have a joint venture with CFE, but they will not put any capital and they will still get 54% of the stock and they will control the entity. And we really trust your money, to be in the hands and in the control of a state entity. So there are many things that at least would make the savvies or all the different. Mexico has an electricity ecosystem that has the large players of the Western world. It has the French, it has the German, it has the Spanish, it has the Korean, it has the Chinese, the American, the Canadian players. They're all here. So they would, be glad to invest if they find a scheme that gives them security that their investment will not be lost and will get a decent return. But the schemes so far as they have been presented do not at first sight seem very attractive. That being said, we'll have to see. We'll have to see if there is some flexibility. And that also applies to transmission, which I didn't mention, but transmission is another area where there needs to be a lot of investment, a lot of development that has not taken place in the last years. It didn't take off also during the Peña Nieto administration, but neither during the López Obrador years. And it's challenging right now. And it's going to be more challenging because you took out of the Constitution some language that allowed for public-private ventures, schemes where you could get private companies to build the infrastructure and then, project finance scheme. So if you take that out, it's more difficult for CFE to do it with its own resources. So we'll have to see how that works.
Delve a little bit more into what you just said in terms that obviously CFE, the Mexican government, they all need and want to have more generation of electricity. The Plan Mexico allegedly will bringing a lot of capital and at the same time you mentioned that the people that are in charge of this sector are not ideologues, that they are technocrats or reasonable people, let's put it that way. Are you hopeful that they might see the need to clarify or change those schemes that you have mentioned as not optimal for private investors?
Yes, I think that they were the same people that preserved 85% of the old electricity industry law, and they preserved even probably 90% of the old CFE law. So despite the ideological language that some of them use in public, the technical terms of the laws are reasonable, did not destroy things that they thought could be used and are useful. So that's a good thing. That being said, inside the administration, there is the same people that populated the energy sector during the López Obrador years are still there. Probably not in the forefront, but there are some debates inside. That explains some of the limitations for these schemes that were introduced, and that probably will make it hard for investors to put their money in those schemes. So I think there is an inside struggle to decide how far they have to go. There is also a day of reckoning. I mean, this year, the Mexican economy is not growing, and the electricity sector has not attracted a lot of investment in the last years. So many of the projects that were started operation during the López Obrador years were projects that came from the Peña Nieto years. So, but Claudia Sheinbaum does not have that benefit. I mean, there are some López Obrador projects. There are quite a lot of López Obrador projects that have not started operations and that are delayed. She mentioned when she presented her electricity expansion plans for CFE in two morning press conferences in February 5th and April the 8th. And she mentioned all these new combined cycle gas-fired plants that will be inaugurated in 2025 and 2026 and 2027 that come from the López Obrador years. But they have an average delay of 18 months per plant. And that's, hopefully the deadlines, the day they will start operations, will be complied with now. But there are some reasons to be skeptical that they will meet the deadlines in this year. So it will probably take them more time. The same with the new plans that CFE put forward in those two morning press conferences. And the same goes for the transmission expansion plans. They're very, very ambitious. If you look at the recent record of CFE, you have grounds to be doubtful that they will, or 100% of them will be realized in time and cost and in all the terms that they were put. So that's a bit of my impression on how challenging the thing is for the Sheinbaum administration. It has a good attitude. It does not have the rhetoric that was constantly being aggressive towards foreign investors. It has technical people in place who are reasonable and who, as you said, are concerned of getting the investors to invest. They have very ambitious plans for CFE, but which are, in my opinion, quite optimistic on the capacity. So we'll have to see.
One last question before we go. So what comes first, energy before growth, or growth generates energy from your perspective?
Well, it's a virtuous or a vicious cycle, right? It's typically Mexico energy demand grew at a higher rate than the economy. And that's become more true for the world in recent years, because everyone is now using electricity for everything. The societies are electrifying. Their energy use is moving towards electricity and away from fuels, even in transportation, where it used to be that gasoline was king, and it's moving out a little bit. And this data center boom everywhere makes electricity demand grow much faster than the economy, both in developed economies and also in economies such as Mexico. So electricity is the input that moves the economy, and that's even more true now than it was before. And that, if you look at prices, for instance, yesterday's Financial Times editorial basically talked about how UK industrial electricity prices were the highest in the OECD, $187 per megawatt hour, which was 3 times as much as the US, 2 times as much as China or India, quite above everywhere. And that hurts your competitivity. And Mexico had an average price of $100 per megawatt hour for industrial users in 2020, and it has 150 now. So it's getting closer to the UK, and it's 3 times the US price now. So it's, electricity comes first, and it allows you to grow with more or less competitiveness.
Well, Cesar, we could be talking for hours here on this very interesting topic. I know you're very interested in it. You've dedicated a lot of your life. We thank you very, very much for the time you've given us. It's been quite interesting. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure.
We're pleased to be joined this week on MEX Moves by José Antonio Aguilar Bueno, founder and managing partner of Vive Energía, a leading wind power company and one of the key players in Yucatan's renewable energy landscape. Founded in 2014, Vive Energía has been a pioneer in developing large-scale clean energy parks in the region through international partnerships and a strong focus on environmental and social integration. The company has helped shape the state's energy transition. Its first project, Eólica del Golfo, launched in 2017-2018 near the town of Tislam Bravo in the northern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. With 28 turbines and a capacity of 70 megawatts, it generates enough energy to power approximately 170,000 households annually, about 6% of the peninsula's electricity capacity. It also helps avoid the emission of 250,000 tons of CO2 each year. In early 2021, the company's second project, Progreso, began operations. This wind farm features 36 turbines and a capacity of 90 megawatts. It's managed by Energía Renovable de la Península, another Vive Energía subsidiary. Together, the two farms generate 160,000 megawatts, representing roughly 13.7% of the Yucatan's installed capacity. Clients include not only the state utility CFE, but also major private sector companies such as Mars Chocolate, Cinépolis, and the Buena Vista Cuautitlan suburban train line. We're very grateful to José Antonio for taking time to talk with us about the current state of Mexico's electricity industry. José Antonio, thank you very much for being with us here.
Hey, Eduardo and Damien, thank you for your invitation. I'm very happy to be here.
Now, let me begin by asking, Viva Energy has reportedly invested close to $290 million to develop and operate its two wind farms. Would you say this level of commitment reflects a general confidence among your team and investors from Mexico, China, and Spain in the current regulatory framework, despite the changes we've seen in recent years?
I think it does. From our part, speaking about Vive Energía, we are definitely committed to the growing Mexico market of our Mexican market. Definitely, we are very committed to it. And not only that, I think that there's a large community of investors, bankers, and developers who is really focused on bringing new energies, new capacity to the market as we speak. So definitely, there is interest and there is really a commitment to do so.
How much? You began when the energy reform started in 2013, 2014. How much has the changes or the obstacles that the previous administration put in delayed, or I know you're expressing confidence, but did it had any impact in probably reassessing the long-term strategy?
Yeah, I think that what you're trying to ask is if we are really in Kansas, if we're not in Kansas anymore or not. I think that the truth is that with the start of the new administration, I think that things started to change. We can say that the years with the President López Obrador were different in the terms that there was not too much interest in having the private sector participate in the power industry or in the energy industry in general, I would say. And I think that nowadays the current administration has a very different focus. It has not only changed the law significantly and the constitution to bring about a more powerful market in Mexico. So that has been a very significant change that we can see in today's market, in today's situation, and that has made or bring about new investors and more developers to the market. So I think that the signaling that we have today is very different from what we had, let's say, 6 years ago in terms of private market participation in the industry, and that has been welcome, positively welcome from the market.
So the new changes are, in your view, despite the fact that the government has greater control over the industry, the changes are more favorable or are not impeding potential growth from Vive Energia and other participants in the market.
So I think that from the Vive Energia perspective, and I believe from a large segment of the market, the changes in the constitution and the laws, mainly by the publication of the new Ley de Servicio Eléctrico, has brought about a more clear and transparent way by which the administration is trying to organize and develop the power industry in Mexico. I think that's true. Now, these are the laws that have been published, and the regulations, we're still missing some of the regulations as to how this law is going to be applied. But the message contained within the laws that have been approved is very positive. Now, once you have, let's say that this is the situation by which you have already published something, but you need to execute. And what is missing today, and what the industry is waiting for, is to see how this new administration is going to be applying the new laws. How is that going to be working? As you know, we no longer have the CRE. We have a new thing called the CNE, which is a very similar, let's say, it's a very similar organization or group of, how can I say, a commission. It's a very similar commission to the CRE, the old Comisión Reguladora de Energía, but now it is contained within the Secretaría de Energía. So this is not an independent body regulating the power industry or the hydrocarbon industry, but mainly this is a Dirección General within the Secretaría de Energía of Mexico that is going to be providing, it's going to be granting permits and changing permits whenever it's required. And so there is a significant change within the new laws that would say that the control of the Secretaría de Energía is going to be very strong. But at the same time, what you can see is that the message is that this CNA is going to be much more focused on arranging. I don't know if the arranging is the right word. It's going to be more focused on organizing the industry. That's the thing. So I think that's a good message. But let's see how the CNE really works at the end of the day. If the CNE starts working the same way that the CRE did during the past administration, that's going to be a big issue, because I think that nothing's going to get done. We still need to see how this is going to be working. But the message is very positive, and so that is why the industry is very keen on participating in the power industry in Mexico. So that's what I would say. And let me say something else. During the past administration, very little of new construction, new capacity was added to the system. So Mexico is lagging behind in its own demand of power. Is lagging behind. So no new capacity was added for probably 5 to 6 years. And now we are paying those consequences. And now that's why the administration is looking to have new participants and new money coming in to invest into the market.
Jose Antonio, wind power has suffered problems globally. Returns have been lower than many of the producers would have liked. And you've seen some of the majors, like Shell and BP and others, kind of exit or announce that they're exiting in part wind power. In Mexico, I think Macquarie, if I'm right, had problems in Oaxaca with local communities. And obviously in Mexico, when the previous administration gave sales, certificados de energía limpios, to CFE for hydroelectric plants, that devalued the sales and made wind less attractive in relative terms. And then you've got the transmission sort of bottlenecks in Mexico that's particularly relevant for wind power, as I understand it. So if you put all those factors together, shouldn't I be a bit concerned about the future of wind power in Mexico?
Yeah, well, wind power is one of the technologies, renewable technologies that is very much used around the world. But yes, I think that you're right in the sense that the technology probably has become less competitive, let's put it that way, than, for example, solar power in terms of renewable energy. And developers in Mexico have really run into problems in some cases. You mentioned the case of Macquarie, which ran into troubles with a large project in Oaxaca. So you have one thing is that, and because you're mixing behind a lot of things with your question, let me just go part by part. In terms of the wind power industry, I think that wind power has some benefits beyond or above those of solar power, let's put it, because you can have generation at peak hours, and peak hours are during the night mainly, or in the afternoons, midnight, during the night, and solar power. They can't. There's no generation during the night. So you have a factor that has probably a technology that brings about more power during peak hour times. That's a benefit vis-a-vis the photovoltaic technology. And so that's one issue. But you do have some manufacturers of wind power technology that are running into trouble. And this is like a cycle going up and down, by which higher demand of turbines brings about a very, very positive returns for the power industry, for the wind industry. And sometimes the demand goes down. And nowadays, because of the excess of capacity brought about to the market by the Chinese manufacturers of photovoltaic panels, that has become a very big challenge to the wind industry, or to the wind to the wind technology manufacturers, because they need to be price competitive as well. And since the supply of equipment and parts in order to manufacture the wind turbines are limited, there is no way to respond to a higher demand and to bring about prices down for the wind industry. So wind industry cost of generation, which is called the LCOE, has been very stable in the past years. The prices have not gone down, and the LCOE, or the cost of generating electricity from photovoltaic technology, has come down very significantly. And so that has made the developer to start choosing the photovoltaic industry vis-a-vis the wind technologies, and that has hurt the manufacturers of the wind industry significantly. Now, the thing is that the other big change in the market that is coming about is that the storage technologies that sometimes that we're looking to go hand in hand with the solar, the photovoltaic, that has also come down. So now the combination today of photovoltaic plus storage capacity, let me just tell you about the benefit of storage in a moment, has the combination of those two technologies, the storage and photovoltaic, has also brought tremendous competition vis-a-vis the wind industry. Now, let me tell you why is the storage so significantly important in this industry? It's because you generate electricity with the wind, with a solar farm during the day, where demand of electricity normally is lower than in the afternoons and the nights. So what ends up happening is that some of that electricity that you generate during the day with the photovoltaic will go to batteries that will release the power or the energy that they have stored during the day. They will release it during the night, taking advantage of higher energy prices and making the economics of a solar project much more interesting than a single photovoltaic power with no storage. So the competition of these two technologies put combined has made tremendous inroads into the wind farm technologies. Now, you can have a wind farm also with storage, but sometimes that is not even necessary, because wind does generate during the nights. So that has made, for a developer such as ourselves, that is a quandary. Do we want to invest in storage with a wind farm? Probably yes, probably not. But the thing is that it will be a case by case on a single for each project, to see if that is something that is a benefit or not. Where contrary to what has happened in the photovoltaic industry, where storage really is a significant game changer. That's for the industry, for the wind against, let's say, other technologies such as the photovoltaic technology. No? Now, you were also referring to what was your second question? I'm sorry, I forgot the second question.
The previous administration reduced the incentives for renewables by giving the hydroelectric plants the cells, the certificados de energía limpias.
Yeah, that market that was supposed to incentivize the investment of new technologies and renewable power basically was scrapped from the book, mainly because the changes in the regulation regarding the certificados de energía limpia was brought into the market. So yeah, I think that was a significant change into the market. I think that's really happening right now. Just to mention something else, Mexico invested heavily during the administration of Presidente Peña Nieto in gas pipelines all over Mexico, significantly in the occident side of the country, the northern parts as a whole, and also in the region of Veracruz, Tabasco, and Campeche. And so the introduction of these pipelines was made in order to bring power generation close to the centers of demand all over the country. So the balance of, the introduction of these gas pipelines made very attractive to invest also in gas generation for Mexico, especially for CFE, and that has been the focus of CFE right now, to invest in large power facilities, natural gas fired, and that has made also significant inroads in Mexico, but that also got stopped very, very strongly during the López Obrador administration. So Mexico has a very interesting mix of generation, renewables, gas-fired, and some of it with fuel oil and diesel that is supposedly being retired as we speak on a continuing basis. And so that's going to bring about probably some benefits to the market. But let's see what happens. But I didn't want to not to mention what's going on with the natural gas, because natural gas is a very significant technology being used in Mexico to generate power.
So Sheinbaum has talked about, I think, 45% of electricity being generated by renewables by 2030, the end of her term. Jose Antonio, what would you like to see specifically to be announced so that can be achieved and you can grow your footprint?
Well, there are two things that need to happen. I think that one is that the regulation that is going to be applied during this administration is really focused on, it has the clarity and the transparency to incentivize the private investment in Mexico. I think that's very important. You need to have clear rules, and these rules need to be applied continuously and constantly, and so that needs to happen. So that clarity in the regulations, I think that's going to be very important, because the money is there. The interest of investing in Mexico is there. If you go to any power conference, that there's one in every month in Mexico, you see that it's full of people that is trying to understand what's going to happen. How can I be a participant in this industry? How can I benefit? How can I bring about more power into Mexico? I think that's there. The investors, the bankers, developers are there. I think that's a continuous. And the other thing is that what I would like to say, besides that, I think that the Secretaría de Energía has been announcing that it's going to bring about some competition, or is going to be announcing some licitaciones into the market for power generation, for large power generators or large companies, developing companies, to start investing along with CFE into new large power projects. And I think that those type of announcements and the realization of those announcements, that those announcements become a reality, I think that's very important for it. It will be a very significant signaling into the market that things have really changed, that things are changing, and that the objectives and the made by the president of Mexico are at least going to be tried to be fulfilled during this administration. So those two things, clear and consistent regulation, and the announcement of these large power projects, licitaciones, to take place and to be successful in order for us to see these changes into the Mexican market.
In that sense, is Vive Energía planning for an additional wind or solar plant? What are you guys strategizing in terms of your growth and footprint, as Damien said?
Yes. Well, in Vive, we do have we are a developing company, an operating company as well, as you mentioned. So we are definitely developing new projects in the region where we are more successful, which is the Yucatan Peninsula. We are developing projects that add to a capacity of around 1 gigawatt. That's 1,000 megawatts of capacity. So we are developing these projects, and we hope to bring them to the market soon. I think that one of the biggest challenges for developers all over Mexico is that we need to be able to secure transmission capacity. And so that transmission needs to be built by the CFE and be put into the service of the market. So those are the biggest challenges. But Vive Energía is very confident. We are very happy to be where we are, and we are confident that the market is going to be growing in the future. And we are definitely focused on bringing more capacity to the region to the peninsula region, definitely, and all over Mexico. As I tell you, we have more than 1 gigawatt of capacity on the development right now, and we hope to bring it about in the following years. So that's what I can tell you right now.
On that note, Jose Antonio, thank you very much. It's been great to see the perspective of a developer and investor in the sector from within. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thanks to you. Thanks to Damien. I really enjoy being here. My English probably was not the best. Wednesday is not my best English day, but definitely I will try to make it better. If necessary, you let me know.
Thank you, Jose Antonio. You were good enough. Well, that's it for today's podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. We'll be back next week. Damien, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Eduardo.
Thanks for listening, and please don't forget to subscribe, and we'll be back next week.